in this talk of innate immunity, we're going to have a brief look at the complement pathway. So by the end of this talk, we'll have a better understanding of the complement system. The complement proteins are a collection of more than 30 different soluble proteins that are present in blood as well as bodily fluids. They were initially discovered in vertebrates. However, now we know that homologs of some complement proteins are also found in invertebrate organisms. A lot of complement proteins are thioester proteins, and when we look at vertebrates, the complement proteins are mainly synthesized in the liver. Now, the complement proteins work together and form a cascade that's called as the complement pathway. The complement pathway aids in the pathogen elimination as well as induction of inflammation. These complement proteins on their own are not antimicrobial in nature, but when the complement pathway gets activated, that is when pathogens can get eliminated. Now, the different complement proteins can mediate many different functions of the complement pathway. So let us look at some of the proteins and their functions. Now, some complement proteins are able to identify features on a pathogen, and usually these features form a pattern, and hence they are called as pathogen-associated molecular patterns, or PAMPs. So some complement proteins are able to identify and bind to these PAMPs, and such complement proteins are also called as pattern recognition receptors, or PRRs. Some other complement proteins have enzymatic function associated with them, and this enzymatic function is usually in the form of a proteolytic enzyme activity. There are other complement proteins that are able to bind to the surface of different cells like bacteria or other types of pathogens. Sometimes they're able to bind to even host cells. There are other complement proteins that are able to mediate inflammation when the pathway gets activated. On the other hand, there are other complement proteins that are able to attack the membranes of cells, and these can include host cells as well as pathogen cells. We also have complement proteins that are able to bind to other complement proteins, and hence they function as complement receptors. They're normally present in the phagocytic immune cells and help in the removal of complement that is bound to a pathogen. There are other complement proteins that are also able to regulate the activity of other complement proteins, and this way they're able to regulate any collateral damage that can happen to the host cells when the complement pathway gets activated. Now, when a pathogen is able to overcome the epithelial barriers of the host and enter the host, that is when the complement system is activated. There are three main pathways of complement activation that have been studied in vertebrates. The first one is called as the alternative pathway. The second one is the lectin pathway, and then we have the classical pathway. Now, the complement system is an ancient form of host defense, and so when we look at the evolution of the complement pathways, the alternative pathway evolved first, followed by the lectin pathway, and then the classical pathway. With this, we come to the end of an introduction to the complement system, where we learned that there are different complement proteins, and there are three different types of complement pathways, which are the lectin pathway, the alternative pathway, and the classical pathway.